Breaking report. Behind the heavily guarded gates of Buckingham Palace, an unprecedented, silent overhaul has just rendered the traditional order of the British monarchy obsolete. Reports leaking from the deepest recesses of the royal household confirm that absolute operational control of the sovereign's domain has been wrested from the reigning king in a swift, calculated maneuver. Tonight, we breach the velvet curtain to reveal the dark, high-stakes intrigue, the closed-door betrayals, and the final, haunting command of a dead queen that has effectively severed the reign of King Charles before the ink on his legacy could dry. Inside the gold-leafed state chamber, the air hung thick with suffocating dread. The Privy Council, an elite circle of advisors, lawyers, and senior operatives, stood frozen in absolute silence. Not one had been briefed on the true nature of this emergency summons. Hands trembled as leather-bound portfolios were clutched tightly against chests. The flickering candlelight caught the moisture on the brows of men who had spent their lives managing power, only to realize that power was shifting beneath their feet without their consent. At the center of the room stood King Charles. He did not look like a triumphant monarch. He looked like a man executing his own abdication in spirit. Every step he took toward the mahogany table echoed like a tolling bell. Beneath his quiet exterior, a profound exhaustion dragged at his frame. He carried a heavy folder containing a sealed declaration, a document hidden in the royal archives since the cold autumn days following Queen Elizabeth II's passing. It was her final private command, locked away until the exact moment duty demanded its activation. Standing a few paces away was Prince William, his knuckles white as he clenched his hands behind his back. Micro-expressions of shock flickered across his face. The document did not merely outline minor administrative shifts. It explicitly transferred the entirety of the Crown's active operational authority into William's hands. While Charles would retain the Crown, the active helm, the daily control over state duties, senior appointments, and strategic direction, was being passed to his heir. Watching from the shadows near the tall, arched windows was Queen Consort Camilla. Her posture was rigid, her expression a mask of cold, restrained fury. For decades, Camilla had systematically navigated the treacherous waters of palace intrigue, surviving public hostility to cement her place beside the king. She had calculated every move and built a formidable inner circle within the household. Yet in this single moment, she was forced to watch her constructed empire dissolve. Her eyes darted with venomous precision between the king and the prince as authority pulled away from her, gravitating irresistibly toward William. Charles unclipped his fountain pen. His hand hesitated for a fraction of a second, a micro-tremor that did not escape the watchful eyes of the council. He pressed his heavy signet ring into the warm red wax, stamping the royal cipher onto the parchment. The seal was set. The transfer was legal, absolute, and irreversible. Lifting his head, Charles avoided looking directly at Camilla. Instead, his gaze locked onto his son. "Your grandmother prepared you for this," Charles whispered, his voice raspy with suppressed grief. "Long before either of us understood why." Beside the decree lay a second envelope bearing the sharp handwriting of the late queen, addressed personally to William. But before the prince could reach for his grandmother's final words, he was forced into a tense, closed-door confrontation with his father. The heavy oak doors of the private antechambers slammed shut. "Why didn't you tell me?" William asked, his voice filled with raw, agonizing hurt. He had spent years proving his loyalty, quietly shouldering an immense burden of statecraft. To have this monumental authority thrust upon him without warning felt less like an honor and more like an ambush. Charles stood near the cold fireplace, staring down at his weathered hands. "Because warning you would have forced you to live a lie," the king answered softly, carrying the crushing weight of a father's guilt. "It would have forced you to smile for cameras while keeping this secret from the world. I could not place that burden upon you before it was absolute." The explanation brought no solace. William felt an agonizing cocktail of emotions: profound reverence for his grandmother's vision, terrifying concern for his father's fragile health, and a sharp dread that the world would view this transfer not as a sacrifice, but as a son's ruthless act of ambition. Miles away at Kensington Palace, Catherine, Princess of Wales, received an encrypted, handwritten message dispatched immediately following the signing. She read the lines twice as the magnitude of their new reality settled into her soul. Steadied by iron resolve, she immediately penned a brief, four-word response. "You will not stand alone." That message would become William's emotional armor. Meanwhile, back in the quiet corridors of Buckingham Palace, Camilla sat in her private drawing room, staring at a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Outside her doors, the distant sound of hurrying footsteps echoed through the halls. Private secretaries were already redirecting briefings. Courtiers were quietly updating access lists. The palace was actively reorganizing itself around William's court, discarding the old guard like spent armor. Camilla's fingers tightened around the porcelain cup until her knuckles turned translucent. She realized that the battle for the crown was no longer a quiet game of influence. It was an open war for survival. The roots of this quiet coup were meticulously planted years earlier on a bitter winter evening inside the cold stone walls of Windsor Castle. Following the Platinum Jubilee, when the nation cheered for an immortalized queen, Elizabeth II retreated behind closed doors with terrifying clarity. She saw past the bunting. She saw an ancient institution fracturing under the weight of modern scandal and mounting public cynicism. In a private drawing room stripped of courtiers, the late queen had commanded everyone to leave except her son and grandson. But after William had been dismissed, the sovereign delivered the blow that would redefine Charles's life. Recorded in a locked archive, Elizabeth uttered a devastating sentence. "He understands that the crown must protect others before it protects itself." For Charles, who had spent 7 decades sacrificing his personal life for a crown he had not yet worn, the words landed with lethal force. His mother was declaring his reign a temporary bridge, a transitional epoch designed solely to preserve the throne until William was ready. When Charles asked if his preparation amounted to a prearranged surrender, Elizabeth remained unyielding. Preserving the monarchy, she warned, mattered infinitely more than any sovereign's personal pride. She dictated a secret memorandum imposing 3 explicit conditions upon his reign: declining institutional stability, uncontainable public unrest, or the king's own realization that delay would destroy the crown. To ensure no single faction could alter her command, she ordered the decree split into 2 parts. One remained with Charles. The second was sealed deep within the Windsor vault, accessible only to William upon the fulfillment of her conditions. For years, that hidden mandate hung over Charles like an executioner's axe. But when he finally resolved to sign the declaration, the fiercest resistance came from within his own bedchamber. Hours before Charles entered the state chamber, Queen Consort Camilla stood directly between him and the study doors. Only a desperate wife confronted a husband voluntarily surrendering the absolute authority they had suffered decades to acquire. Camilla had endured public vilification to stand beside him as queen. Now, she watched him sign away the operational engine of their kingdom. "Did William demand this?" she asked, her voice tight with furious betrayal. Questioning whether Elizabeth had ever truly trusted him, she accused him of sacrificing their reign to satisfy a ghost's paranoia. "This decision is mine," Charles replied softly. "To wait any longer is not caution, Camilla. It is pride." When she reached frantically for the parchment, Charles drew it back with cold precision. "Where does this leave me?" she demanded, tears of rage glistening in her eyes. "Beside me," the king stated, "but no longer between William and his duty." Behind closed doors, the palace machinery had already begun its shift. Senior private secretaries were secretly redirecting intelligence dossiers to Kensington Palace. William's shadow administration had been quietly assembling for weeks, authorized in absolute secrecy by Charles himself. Yet the final hurdle remained the old guard of the Privy Council. In a darkened briefing room, senior courtiers warned the king that splitting sovereign authority from daily governance created a dangerous, two-headed hydra that could fracture the Commonwealth. Leaning over the heavy table, Charles fixed the advisors with an unyielding glare. "Holding power when a system protects you is simple," the king declared. "Surrendering it voluntarily requires far greater strength." Before the courtiers could counter, Prince William strode into the room. Sensing the council was attempting to humiliate his father, the prince slammed his hand onto the table. "We do not elevate the heir by destroying the sovereign," William growled, forcing the advisors into silence. Yet one final trap remained. Legal advisors produced a hidden clause. The transfer required William to read the second half of Elizabeth's Windsor pages and execute a binding pledge promising never to usurp his father's constitutional supremacy. With the room holding its breath, William broke the red wax of the second envelope. As his eyes scanned his grandmother's final written command, a private secretary burst through the doors, pale and gasping. An internal leak had breached the palace walls, broadcasting the secret transfer of power to the global press before the king could speak, plunging the monarchy into an instant, wild panic. The leak struck like a thunderbolt, shattering the carefully orchestrated illusion of order just 23 minutes before the king was scheduled to address the nation. Across global newsrooms, red banners flashed frantically. "King to surrender power." The palace switchboards exploded into a frenzy of red lights as panicked diplomats, foreign heads of state, and news anchors demanded to know whether Britain was witnessing a medical emergency, a forced retirement, or a quietly executed palace coup. Inside her private apartments, Catherine, Princess of Wales, dismissed her aides and secured the encrypted line to William. She did not ask about the vast expansion of their royal household, nor the historical authority about to land upon their shoulders. Her voice was steady, filled with a quiet, fierce protectiveness. "Is your father safe?" she asked softly. "Is he all right?" William, standing in a secluded corridor with blood rushing in his ears, felt the sheer weight of her question. The global media was already painting Charles as a broken, sickly monarch being nudged into the shadows by an ambitious son. For William, who had accepted this monumental transfer only to preserve his father's dignity, the leak was an unbearable insult. "They are turning his sacrifice into a surrender," William muttered, his jaw set in a hard, dangerous line. In the Queen's private suite, Camilla staged her own final act of rebellion. When a chief communications officer arrived to escort her to the broadcast room, she stood frozen near the window, dressed in dark silk, her hands trembling as she held a handkerchief. "I will not stand beside him for this," she stated, her voice icy and trembling with quiet outrage. "I will not smile for the cameras while the world celebrates the dismantling of my husband's reign." Her refusal was a devastating blow to palace unity. Camilla understood with bitter clarity that the public narrative was set. William and Catherine with a radiant future, while she and Charles were being relegated to the history books. She watched decades of brutal PR survival dissolve in a single afternoon. Meanwhile, royal security operatives frantically traced the source of the breach. It had not originated from Kensington Palace or the press office. The leak came from deep within the sovereign's own inner circle, a veteran courtier who had served the palace for 30 years. Escorted into a private holding room, the official stood before the king and prince without an ounce of remorse. "The public deserved the raw truth," the courtier declared coldly, before palace spinners could dilute it into meaningless courtly prose. Charles listened to the confession in absolute silence. His face was unreadable, his eyes distant. The surrounding guards waited for a thunderous royal outburst, but the king merely raised a quiet, heavy hand. "Leave us," he commanded softly. When the doors cleared, Charles turned to his heir. The tension between father and son had reached its absolute breaking point. "Walk with me," the king said quietly. Stepping out of the suffocating palace into the crisp, damp air of the Buckingham Palace gardens, the two men walked alone beneath the towering oak trees. No armed escorts, no private secretaries, no legal advisors were permitted to follow. For the first time in their lives, the king and the prince stood stripped of statecraft, protocol, and audience. Charles stopped beside the stone perimeter wall. The muffled roar of thousands of citizens gathered outside the gates echoed through the trees. The king turned to face his son, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Your grandmother did not create this secret mandate to secure the succession, William," Charles confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "She created it to save you." William frowned, stepping closer. "Save me?"
She watched this crown consume her life, and she watched it break mine, Charles said, his voice cracking with raw emotional honesty. She saw how obligation turns affection into cold distance. She saw how duty turns fathers into strangers to their own sons. She knew that if you waited as long as I did, the weight of this institution would destroy your family before you ever reached the throne. The king reached out, placing his weathered, trembling hands directly onto William's shoulders.
The non-verbal gesture broke through decades of royal detachment. "I apologize, William," Charles whispered, his voice heavy with the crushing regret of a lifetime. "I apologize for every moment my duty made me unreachable to you. You were forced to interpret my silence as affection and my absence as sacrifice. I cannot undo those lost years, but I can give you your future." William's chest heaved as the emotional wall he had maintained for decades crumbled. "If I accept this power now," William replied, his voice strained with agonizing doubt, "the world will believe I forced your hand. They will see ambition where there is only obedience." "Let them think what they wish," Charles commanded, his grip tightening on his son's shoulders, his eyes fierce with paternal authority. "Do not become me, William. Do not wait so long to choose your family that the crown makes the choice for you." The words echoed in the quiet garden like a sacred oath. William closed his eyes, remembering a strikingly similar warning Queen Elizabeth had whispered to him years earlier at Windsor. Power commands respect, but humanity preserves trust. Slowly, the prince opened his eyes, the conflict within him settling into absolute resolve. He looked into his father's eyes and delivered his terms. "I will accept the declaration," William declared firmly. "But on one condition. You do not step into the shadows. You remain my chief counselor. You stand beside me at every moment of state significance. We carry this together." Charles stared at his son, a profound sense of relief washing over his aged face. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "Agreed," the king whispered. The balance of power had shifted forever. The son had stepped forward not to conquer his father, but to shield him. Hand in purpose, sovereign and heir turned back toward the palace doors, ready to face the judgment of the world. At precisely 6 o'clock in the evening, every major television network across the globe abruptly interrupted its standard programming. An eerie, suffocating stillness blanketed the nation as the familiar crimson banner of breaking news flashed across screens in millions of homes, bustling railway stations, and darkened executive suites. High above the iron gates of Buckingham Palace, the royal standard snapped heavily against the damp evening wind, signaling that the sovereign remained within the fortress. Yet the seismic message delivered beneath that historic flag would permanently dismantle 3 centuries of royal tradition and rewrite the destiny of the House of Windsor forever. When King Charles appeared on screen, he spoke with a slow, agonizingly deliberate cadence, knowing that a single trembling breath or misspoken phrase could ignite a devastating constitutional catastrophe. Through the harsh glare of the studio lights, he clarified the absolute truth of the moment. He was not abdicating his throne. He would remain sovereign, the legal holder of the crown, defender of the faith, and supreme head of state. But active leadership, the daily control over state affairs, senior diplomatic appointments, strategic policy, and the relentless machinery of the monarchy was being irrevocably transferred into the hands of Prince William. It was a calculated, controlled surrender of operational power, executed with surgical precision to protect the dynasty from the vulnerabilities of an aging reign. Outside the palace walls, a cold, relentless drizzle fell upon the thousands of citizens who had gathered along the mall. Giant screens erected near the marble railings broadcasted the live proceedings from inside the gold-leafed state chamber. When the high-definition cameras captured the monumental moment of King Charles placing Queen Elizabeth's sealed letter directly into his son's hands, the vast crowd fell into a staggering, breathless silence. For several agonizing seconds, no one moved. Even the distant city noise seemed to vanish into the rain. Then, beginning near the iron gates and cascading outward toward Trafalgar Square, a thunderous, overwhelming wave of applause erupted, a collective, emotional recognition of a father's historic sacrifice. William stood before the cameras without a single trace of personal triumph or victorious pride. His face was a stern portrait of solemn reverence, carved by the immense weight of the crown he was now forced to carry. Unsealing the late Queen's final page, he read her parting instruction aloud to a stunned global audience. The crown survives when service is passed forward without resentment. The short, poetic sentence acted as a masterstroke of public reconciliation. Overnight, the frantic media speculation of a bitter palace revolt and family betrayal dissolved into profound awe. By morning, every national newspaper featured a striking, dark-toned portrait of father and son standing shoulder to shoulder beneath a singular headline: "The King Who Chose the Future." In her private suite, isolated from the bustling corridors, Queen Consort Camilla watched the broadcast in total, heavy solitude. The ruthless, behind-the-scenes battle for internal influence was finally over, and the losing side had been disarmed without a single public shot being fired. Her once formidable network of senior courtiers and private secretaries was actively dispersing, quietly seeking favor, new assignments, and security within Prince William's rapidly expanding court at Kensington Palace. Camilla recognized with bitter clarity that her era of shaping statecraft and controlling palace access had vanished into the shadows. Yet, when Charles finally returned to their private quarters, exhausted, pale, and carrying the physical toll of his decision, she stepped forward and took his hand without a word. The raw political power had slipped through her fingers, but the quiet, enduring loyalty of their personal union remained unbroken against the storm. At Kensington Palace, Catherine, Princess of Wales, moved with quiet, unyielding authority to secure the new era. She managed the transition with masterly grace, actively blocking ambitious aides from constructing a competitive or aggressive dynamic between the two royal households. There would be no rival courts, no conflicting public narratives, and no factional infighting. Under her watchful guidance, the new executive structure was built upon unified purpose, ensuring that William's newly acquired operational dominance served as an impenetrable shield around the reigning king, rather than a symbol of his displacement. Late that night, after the diplomats had departed, the press corps had cleared, and the massive oak doors of the palace were bolted shut, William returned to the silent, cavernous state chamber. On the long mahogany table, beside the empty leather folders, lay King Charles's gold signet ring, the historical mark of absolute royal approval and personal sovereignty. William picked up the heavy gold ring, walked across the dim room to where his father sat staring out into the pitch-black palace gardens, and gently placed it back into Charles's open palm. The king looked down at the engraved seal, then slowly closed his son's fingers tightly around it, a final, deeply emotional gesture of shared authority, forgiveness, and generational healing. In the cold, unforgiving light of history, Charles's reign would never be measured by its length, nor by the extravagant grandeur of state spectacles. His ultimate legacy became the quiet, selfless courage to step back before illness, frailty, or institutional crisis could tear the monarchy apart. He had honored his mother's hidden wish, securing the modern survival of the crown by choosing his son's destiny over his own personal pride. As the dark shadows of an unprecedented era stretched across Buckingham Palace, the ancient institution did not lose a king. It witnessed the terrifying, magnificent grandeur of a sovereign who saved the throne by knowing when to let it go. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.